It was late when I got the call, and even though the precinct clock read just past midnight, it felt later. One of those nights where time drags its feet through a thick fog of exhaustion. My name's Detective Sam Thorne, and this was supposed to be my night off. But as any cop will tell you, murder doesn't check the schedule. Thorne, we've got a bad one, Captain Hughes said, his voice low and clipped over the line. You're going to want to see this for yourself. 4th and Pine, old textile factory. By the time I arrived, the crime scene had already drawn a crowd. Flashing red and blue lights reflected off rain-slick streets, casting eerie shadows on the crumbling brick facade of the factory. Uniforms were busy setting up the perimeter, holding back a mix of gawkers and late-night drunks who'd stumbled across the commotion. The factory was a relic of another time, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. It had been abandoned for years, but now it was the site of something far more sinister. I flashed my badge and ducked under the yellow tape, the scent of mildew and something metallic, coppery, and unmistakable, filling my nose as I stepped inside. Detective, Officer Monroe greeted me, his face pale under the dim glow of the factory's single working light. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. It's bad, sir." Monroe wasn't one to rattle easily. He'd been on the force for nearly a decade and had seen his fair share of horrors. Whatever was in here, though, had shaken him to his core. "Show me," I said, steeling myself. We moved deeper into the factory, our footsteps echoing off the empty walls. The air grew colder, heavier as we approached the center of the room. There, under the harsh beam of a portable floodlight, was the body. It was a woman, mid-30s, dressed in what looked like office attire, a pencil skirt and blouse now soaked with blood. Her hands were bound with coarse rope, her legs splayed unnaturally. A message had been scrawled above her on the wall in what I could only assume was her blood. "All debts must be paid." I've seen a lot of gruesome things in my line of work, but this was something else. The precision of the cuts on her wrists, the way the rope had been tied, this wasn't someone losing control in a fit of rage. This was calculated, methodical. "Who found her?" I asked, my voice sounding more detached than I felt. "Couple of kids sneaking in for a dare," Monroe replied. "They ran out screaming and flagged down a patrol car." I nodded, taking in the scene. Something about the message bothered me. It wasn't just the brutality of it, it was the implication. This wasn't random. Whoever did this had a reason, a twisted, sick reason, but a reason nonetheless. "Get the forensics team in here," I said, "and make sure we've got a full sweep of the area. If this bastard left so much as a hair behind, I want it bagged and tagged." Monroe nodded and stepped away to make the call. I crouched down beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene. Her face was contorted in terror, her green eyes, so similar to my own, staring blankly at the ceiling. A faint scar on her brow caught the light, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite place. Recognition? No, that couldn't be. I didn't know her. But as I stood and surveyed the room, the feeling wouldn't leave me. Something about this whole thing felt personal. And that's when I saw it. Just beneath the message on the wall, faint but deliberate, was another mark. A symbol. It was small, no bigger than a playing card, and etched into the wall, like an afterthought. A triangle with a line bisecting it. I'd seen it before years ago, on a case that still haunted me. "Monroe!" I barked, my voice echoing through the factory. "Get me everything we have on the Ellison murders." Monroe froze, his face tightening. "You think it's connected?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the symbol, my mind racing. The Ellison case had been my first big one as a detective, and it had nearly broken me. 5 victims, all bound and murdered with the same precision, the same message left behind. But we'd caught the guy. Or so we thought. "I don't know yet," I said finally, turning back to Monroe. "But if it is, we've got a bigger problem on our hands than we thought." Monroe nodded grimly and stepped away to relay my order. The memories of the Ellison case crashed over me like cold waves, long nights of chasing shadows, sleepless days filled with dead ends. We'd nailed a suspect back then, a drifter named Paul Rayburn. The evidence had been solid. Fibers from the rope, his prints at one of the scenes, and even a journal filled with disturbing sketches. He was serving life without parole. But standing here now, staring at that symbol, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd gotten it wrong. Or worse, that someone else had been pulling the strings. All along, Detective Thorne, a voice called from behind me. I turned to see Dr. Emily Corwin, the precinct's lead forensic pathologist, stepping into the factory. She was bundled in a long coat, her black hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, her expression as sharp as always. I came as soon as I heard. "Glad you're here, Doc," I said, gesturing to the body. "I need your eyes on this." She nodded and approached the victim with practiced care, snapping on a pair of gloves. As she began her initial examination, I turned my attention back to the symbol. It felt deliberate, like it was left there just for me. Whoever had done this wanted me to know they were back, or maybe they'd never left. "Thorne," Corwin said, pulling me from my thoughts. Her tone was measured, but I could hear the edge of concern. The precision of these wounds, it's surgical. This wasn't just about killing her, it was about making a statement. And the blood spatter patterns suggest she was alive when it started. I clench my jaw. Whoever this bastard was, they'd taken their time, making her death as drawn out and agonizing as possible. "Can you estimate time of death?" "Roughly 6 to 8 hours ago," she replied. "I'll know more after the autopsy, but this was planned, Detective. Deliberate, planned and deliberate. Two words that never boded well in my line of work. I turned back to the symbol, my gut twisting. "Do me a favor, document. When you get her back to the lab, check for anything out of the ordinary, tattoos, markings, anything that might connect her to the Ellison victims." She gave me a sharp look, but didn't argue. "I'll let you know what I find." As Corwin continued her work, Monroe returned with a file in hand. "Ellison case records," he said, handing it over. "They're a mess. Half of this is still in storage." I flipped through the folder, the photos and notes as haunting as I remembered. The same message, all debts must be paid, had been left at every scene. The same careful binding of the victims. And that symbol. But there was one thing that didn't add up. The victims back then had all been part of a high-stakes poker ring. They'd owed debts to the wrong people, debts they couldn't repay. This woman didn't fit the profile. She wasn't a gambler. At least, not that we knew of yet. "Do we have an ID on her?" I asked. Monroe shook his head. "Not yet. No purse, no wallet. She's a ghost, just like the killer." I closed the file, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "Start digging. Look into missing persons reports, anyone who fits her description. And check the damn cameras in this area. Someone had to see something." As Monroe nodded and moved to follow through, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting an update from the precinct, but the number was blocked. My gut tightened as I answered. "Thorne," I said tersely. There was a pause, and then a voice, a low, gravelly whisper that sent a chill down my spine. "Detective, you've been paying attention. Good. Let's see if you can keep up." The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at the phone, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't just a murder. It was a game. And I'd just been invited to play. But if they thought I'd fold under pressure, they didn't know me. Not yet. I stood there for a moment, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The game had started, and I had no intention of playing by their rules. Whoever this was, they were toying with me, and that symbol on the wall, it was their calling card. I turned back to Monroe, who was on his radio, coordinating with the other officers. "Monroe," I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. He looked up immediately. "Get a tech on this," I said, holding up my phone. "Trace the call. I want to know where it came from." "On it," he replied, stepping away to relay the order. The factory suddenly felt colder, the silence pressing in on me. The distant hum of voices from the uniforms outside seemed a world away. This wasn't just a crime scene anymore, it was a battlefield, and the killer had fired the first shot. Dr. Corwin stood, peeling off her gloves. "I'll have the body transported as soon as possible," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a hint of unease. "But I'd be lying if I said this didn't feel like something bigger." "It is," I replied grimly. "It always is." She gave me a nod, then hesitated. "Be careful, Sam," she said softly before turning to leave. It wasn't like her to get personal, and that only made her words weigh heavier. I stayed behind as the forensics team began their work, taking another long look around the factory. The symbol on the wall kept pulling at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. It was as if it held the key to everything, and yet it taunted me with its ambiguity. The Ellison case had been a nightmare, but this felt different. Back then, we were chasing a man who left behind chaos and carnage, but this was calculated, precise, and personal. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the victim. It was about me. Back at the precinct, the bullpen was quiet, save for the hum of computers and the occasional rustle of paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the open case files spread out across my desk. I had every detail of the Ellison murders laid out before me, trying to find the thread that tied it all together. Monroe walked in, a coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. He set the folder down in front of me. "We got a hit on the Vic," he said. "Jane Merrick, 36, worked as a paralegal for a corporate law firm downtown. Anything that connects her to the Ellison case?" I asked, flipping through the folder. "Not yet," he said, shaking his head. "No gambling debts, no criminal record. Her coworkers said she kept to herself, no enemies they could think of. But get this, she'd filed a police report 3 weeks ago. Said she was being followed. That got my attention. Who was following her?" "She didn't know," Monroe replied. "Said she kept seeing the same car outside her apartment, the same guy in the crowd when she was out running errands." The report went cold. No leads, no follow-up. I frowned, the pieces of the puzzle refusing to fit together. We need to dig deeper. Phone records, emails, anything that might tell us who she was in contact with before she died. "Already on it," Monroe said. "But there's something else. Tech trace that call you got at the scene." I sat up straighter, and it came from a burner phone, he said, his expression grim. "Untraceable. But it pinged off a tower less than a mile from the factory. They were close. Close enough to watch the scene, maybe even watch me." That realization sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "Thanks, Monroe," I said, grabbing my coat. "Keep me updated." "Where are you going?" he called after me. "To follow up on a hunch," I replied, heading for the door. The drive to Jane Merrick's apartment was short, the streets eerily quiet in the early hours of the morning. Her building was modest, a red brick structure that had probably seen better days. I parked across the street, scanning the area. No sign of anyone watching, but that didn't mean they weren't there. Inside, the landlord was cooperative, if a little grumpy about being woken up. He let me into her apartment, a small, tidy space that offered few clues. A photo on the mantel caught my eye, Jane with an older man, their smiles genuine. Her father, maybe? I made a mental note to find out. On her desk, I found a stack of legal documents and a notepad filled with scribbled notes. Most of it was routine work stuff, but one phrase jumped out at me, underlined 3 times. "The Hollow Man." I frowned, the words tugging at a memory I couldn't quite place. It wasn't part of the Ellison case, but it felt familiar. I snapped a photo of the page with my phone, then continued my search. In the bedroom, I found a small safe tucked into the back of her closet. It was locked, but a quick call to the landlord got me the combination. Inside were more documents, bank statements, a passport, and a folded piece of paper with the same symbol from the factory drawn on it. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. Jane had known something that got her killed. And now that symbol wasn't just a message. It was a breadcrumb trail leading straight to her murderer. Back at the precinct, I spread the new evidence across my desk, the pieces slowly starting to form a picture, albeit a blurry one. The Hollow Man, the symbol, the Ellison case, it was all connected, but I couldn't see how. Not yet. And then it hit me. The name, the Hollow Man. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a reference. A case I'd heard about years ago, one that had gone unsolved. A series of murders across state lines, all with the same precision, the same cryptic symbols left behind. If this killer was picking up where the Hollow Man left off, then we were dealing with something far worse than a copycat. We were dealing with a legacy. My phone buzzed again. pulling me from my thoughts. Another blocked number. I answered, my voice steady. Thorn. The voice on the other end was the same as before, cold and taunting. You're getting closer, detective. But remember, every debt comes due. Even yours. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone, the weight of the words settling over me. They weren't just targeting Jane. They were targeting me, and if I didn't figure this out fast, I'd be the one paying the price. Damn, this wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was about survival. My survival. And whoever this was, they'd made it clear they were playing the long game. I sat back, staring at the photos and notes scattered across my desk. My mind was racing, replaying the details over and over. The Hollow Man, the Ellison murders, Jane Merrick, that damn symbol. Every thread felt connected, but the web was too tangled to make sense of yet. Monroe walked in, his expression as tired as I felt. We've got something, he said, dropping another folder onto my desk. Forensics just called in. They found a partial print on the rope that bound her hands. My brow furrowed. Do we have a match? Not yet. It's not in the system, Monroe replied. But it's a start. They're running it through every database we've got access to. Good, I said, flipping the folder open. What about the symbol? Any hits on that? Monroe shook his head. Not yet, but I pulled up everything we have on the Hollow Man. It's thin, mostly old rumors and urban legend stuff. But if this guy's connected to that case, we've got a serious problem. I nodded, my mind already spinning with possibilities. The Hollow Man wasn't just a name. It was a specter that had haunted law enforcement for years. A killer or killers who operated in the shadows, leaving behind cryptic clues and vanishing without a trace. If this was their work, then we were up against something far more dangerous than I'd initially thought. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing a hand over my face. What about Jane Merrick's connections? Anyone stand out? Still working through her phone records, Monroe said. But I did find something interesting. She made a call to a burner phone 2 days before she was killed. The same burner phone that called you at the scene. My stomach dropped. She was in contact with the killer? Looks like it, Monroe said grimly. We don't know what they talked about, no way to trace the conversation. But whatever it was enough to put her on their radar. I stared at the folder, the weight of it pressing down on me. Jane hadn't been a random victim. She'd known something dangerous enough to get her killed. And now I was in the crosshairs, too. Monroe cleared his throat, his voice softer now. Look, Thorne, you need to watch your back. Whoever this is, they're not just messing with you. They're coming for you. I nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. I know, I said quietly. But if they think I'm going to back down, they've got another thing coming. He gave me a small, grim smile. I wouldn't expect anything less. As he left, I turned my attention back to the evidence. The symbol, the phrase, the connections to the Hollow Man. It was all there, just out of reach, like a puzzle with one crucial piece missing. And then it hit me. Jane's notes. The phrase she'd written, the Hollow Man, it wasn't just a reference. It was a clue. I grabbed the photo I'd taken of the notepad and zoomed in on the writing. Beneath the words, faint and nearly illegible, was a string of numbers, 14.23.7. A code, or coordinates. I pulled up a map on my computer and plugged in the numbers as coordinates. The result was a location on the outskirts of town, an old, abandoned church that had been shuttered for years. I grabbed my coat and gun, my heart pounding. This wasn't a coincidence. Jane had left me this clue for a reason, and if this was a trap, I was walking right into it. But there was no turning back now. The game was on, and I was ready to play. The abandoned church loomed in the distance, its crumbling steeple silhouetted against the faint light of a waning moon. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the sound of gravel crunching beneath my boots. My instinct screamed at me to call for backup, but I knew this was something I had to face alone. The wooden doors groaned as I pushed them open, the faint smell of mildew and decay hitting me like a wave. Inside, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, the flickering light of a single candle illuminating the center of the room. There, on the altar, lay another body. My stomach clenched as I stepped closer. It was a man this time, bound and mutilated in the same methodical way as Jane Merrick. His face was frozen in terror, and above him, written in blood, was the same message: all debts must be paid. But this time, there was something more. Next to the body, on the cold stone of the altar, was an envelope with my name scrawled across it in jagged, angry letters. I picked it up with gloved hands, my pulse racing. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of me, taken just days ago, walking out of my apartment. Beneath it was a note: "You've been living on borrowed time, detective. Now it's time to pay your debt." A noise behind me made me spin, gun drawn. A figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a mask, a smooth, featureless oval, like something out of a nightmare. "Drop the gun," they said, their voice distorted, metallic. I didn't move. "You've got my attention. Why don't you tell me what this is all about?" The figure tilted their head, like they were sizing me up. "This isn't about me, detective. It's about you. Your sins. Your failures. Every choice you've made that led you here." I clenched my jaw, keeping my aim steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" they sneered. "Think about the Ellison case. Think about the man you put away. Did you ever stop to wonder if you got the right guy?" My mind raced. Paul Rayburn. The evidence had been airtight, or so I'd thought. But the symbol, the precision, the messages, they were identical to these murders. Could I have been wrong? "You're lying," I said, though the uncertainty in my voice betrayed me. The figure stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. "You didn't solve that case, Thorne. You buried it. And now the real Hollow Man is here to make you pay." Before I could respond, the figure lunged. I fired, but they were fast, knocking the gun from my hand and sending it skittering across the floor. We struggled, their strength surprising me. I managed to land a punch that sent them staggering back, but they recovered quickly, drawing a knife from their belt. Desperation fueled me as I grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground, using it to block their next strike. The fight was brutal, the sound of our struggle echoing through the empty church. Finally, I managed to disarm them, the knife clattering to the floor. I pinned them down, ripping the mask from their face. I froze. It wasn't some faceless monster beneath the mask. It was someone I knew. Monroe. He grinned up at me, blood trickling from his lip. "Surprised?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Shock rooted me in place. "Why?" was all I could manage. "Because you don't get to walk away from your mistakes," he hissed. "You let an innocent man rot in prison while the real killer kept going. I'm here to show you the cost of your arrogance." I tightened my grip on him, my mind racing. It couldn't be true. Monroe had been my partner, my friend. How long had he been planning this? How many lives had he taken to make his twisted point? The sound of sirens in the distance snapped me back to reality. Backup had finally arrived. I kept Monroe pinned until the uniforms burst through the doors, their weapons drawn. "Take him," I said, my voice hollow, "and secure the scene." Monroe didn't resist as they cuffed him, but his grin never faltered. "This isn't over, Thorne," he called as they dragged him away. "The debts aren't paid. Not yet." I stood there, staring at the blood-stained altar, the weight of his words pressing down on me. He was right in a way. This wasn't over. The lives lost, the mistakes made, they would haunt me forever. But as I walked out into the cold night air, I made a silent vow. I would unravel the truth, no matter how deep it went. Because if I'd learned anything tonight, it was this. Sometimes the monsters we hunt are the ones standing right beside us.